The arrival of the 21st century seems to have opened the door to a future we could have never dreamed of, and the past, with all of its secrets to be revealed. Man's ability to create increasingly more complex machines has provided him with the means to detect the oldest light in the universe, and spurred on the search for the moment when it all came into existence. The mysterious code of life found in DNA has begun to be unraveled with all of its astounding complexity and elegant design. And the smallest possible components of matter itself are being pursued for the sole purpose of unlocking the information contained within, information that may well hold the answers to the deepest and most significant questions mankind has ever asked. Who are we? Why are we here? And is this life on earth all there is to the soul's existence? Or is there something more? Christians believe these questions have been answered in the Bible. But what if today's technology could bring about a new level of understanding of the ancient words contained in this revered book? Can science now offer the tools needed to prove that the cornerstone of Christianity is not only a matter of faith, but of established fact? Can these fantastic scientific advances actually provide evidence that there is resurrection from the dead? And did Jesus himself leave behind physical proof of his resurrection that we can see with our own eyes today?
The resurrection is the cornerstone of our faith. Paul said if Christ has not been raised, then our faith is vain. And just a few verses later, he says if the resurrection did not happen, then we are of all persons most to be pitied.
While Christians accept on faith that the Bible's words are true, the world demands solid proof. It's not unlike Jesus' disciple doubting Thomas. He refused to believe unless he could see the wounds on Jesus' body and touch them for himself. But what proof can Christians offer to the doubting Thomases of today?
If Christianity has evidence, I would think Christians would be willing to put it out on the table.
After thousands of years have passed, is it possible to find scientific evidence that Jesus' resurrection from the dead was not only possible, but that it actually happened? What does the historical record tell us about this event? And are there sources outside of the religious texts that might support the resurrection story? Could new scientific technology uncover physical proof that the resurrection story is true? And are Christians willing to go where the scientific evidence leads them? Join us on a monumental quest of discovery, revelation, and hope.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
What was it like in that first moment of creation, the beginning of existence as we know it? How did the world, with its 4 dimensions of height, width, depth, and time, come into being? Without a doubt, it is a singular event of such magnitude that it can never be fully explained. Scientists refer to it as the Big Bang, that moment in time when all matter magically sprang into existence. But what actually happened in that moment, or even just a second before? That, they say, is undefinable. Or is it? Christians believe that God has always existed, and that, according to the Bible, He alone holds the power over life, death, and creation. The ancient text gives Christians countless reasons to believe, and wonderful stories to bolster their faith. But the most important story of all is the recounting of another undefinable moment, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It is the centerpiece of Christianity. But can we prove that it ever happened? And should we even try? Our investigation takes us into a realm where Christians often fear to tread. What proof is there, outside of religious sources, that would indicate the events depicted in the Gospels are true? And are there ancient texts that might support the biblical accounts of the crucifixion and resurrection? To find out, let's take a look at what the Gospels actually tell us about these events.
Jesus was brought to Pilate by the chief priests, and Pilate asked Jesus a number of questions. And finally he decided to flog him. And what the Romans use is what they call a Roman flagrum. Jesus was also mocked as a king, and they put a purple robe on him, and then they put a crown of thorns on his head. They also beat his face, and then later on, Pilate decides to crucify him. Jesus is nailed through the wrists and through the feet, and his body is then lifted up on a cross where he is in a position of trying to get his breath, pulling himself up in order to get a breath. And what happens to the individual is that they go in this to and fro manner until they actually fatigue and they die of asphyxiation. But in Jesus' case, he actually died of congestive heart failure.
Hanging on the cross, with convicted criminals on either side of him, the Roman soldiers had to be sure he was dead before removing the body. The Gospel accounts tell us how they did this through some rather graphic testimony.
Because the Jews did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water.
After the crucifixion of Jesus, his dead body was taken down from the cross, and Joseph of Arimathea requested permission from Pilate to bury that body of Jesus in a tomb. And he and Nicodemus did that with spices and with linens. And the women, we're told, who so faithfully waited at the cross of Christ where he died, stood there and watched him do all of this. And they completed the process and rolled the stone in front of the door, and he was buried.
A brutal death and a quiet burial. This is the picture we find in the Gospel accounts. We are also told that for 3 days after the crucifixion, the disciples of Christ were scattered and scared. The body of their leader lay in the tomb along with all of their hopes for a Savior and King. But something happened to change all that, something unexplainable.
After the death of Jesus, as we might imagine, the disciples went through a very difficult time on that first weekend. And we're told that they were hiding for fear of the Jews, and they'd lost their confidence, and Peter denied him 3 times, and only John shows up at the cross, according to the accounts, and they had before that been scattered in Gethsemane. But after they see the risen Jesus, everything is turned on its head. The disciples are confident. They are preaching. When they are told, hey, stop this or we're going to have to punish you, they say we ought to obey God rather than men. I mean, they went from being forlorn and worried and hiding and fearful to being confident and being transformed, all because they believed they saw the risen Jesus.
Did the disciples of Christ see what they claimed to have seen, the risen person of Jesus? In a letter the Apostle Peter wrote to some of the earliest Christians, he proclaimed the truth with unwavering certainty.
We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of His majesty.
Bold and unequivocal in its assertion, Peter's statement is matched only by the inspiring testimony of the apostles' lives.
Well, think about the evidence of an eyewitness in a court case. One of the things that you as a juror have to ask is there any ulterior motive for this testimony? What does this person have to gain by lying? In the case of the apostles, they had no earthly reward to gain and every earthly comfort to lose, yet they persisted. In fact, they were willing to spend the rest of their lives proclaiming the message of salvation through faith in Jesus without any payoff from a human point of view. No retirement plan, no 401k, no cozy villa waiting for them in Capernaum. They faced a life of hardship. They were ridiculed, beaten, imprisoned, and finally, most of them were executed in tortuous ways. Why? Because they were convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had seen Jesus Christ alive.
The Bible is undoubtedly the best source for information about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Yet there are those who would dismiss these accounts outright simply because of their religious subject matter. But are there other sources of information that might uphold the resurrection story? Sources that have no religious affiliation whatsoever?
We know a striking number of things about Jesus from outside the New Testament. We have about 12 comments from secular and non-Christian historians, government officials, and so on. And from these sources, we can put together a life of Jesus without ever opening the New Testament. And in this body of material, we even have a reference or two to at least to the disciples' belief in resurrection. And here I'm talking about the Josephus comment, where he's actually saying the disciples believed he was raised from the dead.
Josephus is not the only ancient writer to support the gospel stories. At least 9 strictly secular ancient documents speak either of Jesus or the key beliefs of the early Christians. Among the authors are Cornelius Tacitus, the most important Roman historian of the 1st century.
Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman historian who confirms that Jesus was crucified as a criminal under Pontius Pilate. He also tells us that Christianity had its origins in ancient Judea.
Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome.
In his text, Tacitus tells us the persecuted people were called Christians, and he explains how the group got their name. The extreme penalty Tacitus refers to in the passage is crucifixion, by far the most cruel fate anyone could suffer in the Roman Empire. And it's widely believed that the mischievous superstition he refers to is the Christians' belief in the resurrection of Christ from the dead. Examining the evidence for himself, that's what Jesus' doubtful disciple Thomas insisted on. But what if he were around today? And what if he had never seen the physical evidence of Jesus' resurrected body? Would the evidence found in the writings of non-Christian witnesses carry enough weight to convince him? Or would he demand the answers to even more difficult questions? For example, the ancient sources clearly verify that Jesus was crucified. But did he actually die on the cross? The mere suggestion that Jesus might have survived his brutal punishment would make many Christians very uncomfortable. Yet the doubting Thomas of today may well ask the same question. So, what really happened to Jesus' body on that first Easter morning? After 2,000 years have passed, can the fact of Jesus' death be proved beyond the shadow of a doubt? One man, controversial in his words, miraculous in his deeds, and steadfast in his last hours of torment and death. Jesus undoubtedly knew his fate from the very beginning, and he tried to warn his followers of what was to come. Yet after he was taken into custody, many of his disciples went into hiding. But John's Gospel tells us that at least one of the 12 was there to witness the terrible event of his crucifixion, and the things he saw at the foot of the cross convinced him that Jesus was in fact dead.
One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true.
What is the meaning of this strange description? Are the words in John's Gospel simply the emotional account of a subjective witness? Or is there more to John's story than meets the eye? Could it be that the details provided in John's Gospel may give us the key to verifying that Jesus was dead and shed light on the actual cause of his death? And how can modern medical science help us solve the mystery? Dr. Alexander Metherell is an expert on the subject of death by crucifixion and holds a doctorate degree in engineering. More importantly, he's a medical doctor who is board certified in diagnosis by the American Board of Radiology and has been a consultant to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute of the National Institutes of Health.
The Gospels give us some very important information about the cause of death of Jesus. We know that the Romans gave Jesus a very severe flogging before he took up the cross to go to Golgotha to be nailed to it. This is important because it means that Jesus would have lost a lot of blood even before he was nailed to the cross. In other words, he would have been in serious to critical condition medically. And in fact, the descriptions we get from the gospel accounts indicate that Jesus would have been passing out or fainting and also been extremely thirsty. And this, in medical terms, is called hypovolemic shock.
The diagnosis of hypovolemic shock, brought about by massive blood loss, is certainly compelling. But can this help us to prove that Jesus actually died on the cross, as the Gospels say he did? The answer lies in the unusual description found in chapter 19 of John's Gospel.
From a medical standpoint, the description in John chapter 19 is important because it perfectly coincides with the medical condition that Jesus went through at that time. The massive blood loss Jesus experienced from the flogging probably led to heart failure, and this would have caused a clear fluid to collect in the membrane around the heart and lungs. So when the spear penetrated Jesus' side, it probably went through the lung and into the heart. When the spear was pulled out, the clear fluid that had gathered around the heart, which would have looked like water, came out. This would have been followed by a large volume of blood from the heart. The account given in John's Gospel shows us that it's completely consistent with the medical history. Therefore, we can conclude without any shadow of a doubt that Jesus died on the cross. It's completely impossible for him to have survived that crucifixion.
The ravages of a brutal beating, the penetrating wounds of the nails in his hands and feet, and a slow death by asphyxiation as he hung on the cross, these are the traumas that undoubtedly sealed Jesus' fate. But according to the Christian faith, what happened next remains to this day the most miraculous occurrence of all of recorded history. That first Easter morning found the tomb of Christ empty. But what happened to the body? The Bible tells us Jesus rose from the dead and conquered death and sin in one fatal blow. Skeptics, however, have an alternative explanation. They suggest the body was stolen, perhaps by the disciples who snuck into the tomb at night when those assigned to guard it were sleeping. Which story is true? Securing the body of Jesus became the responsibility of the Roman guards, a group of 16 highly disciplined soldiers whose failure would cost them their own lives. As a result, they slept in shifts to ensure at least 4 soldiers were always on duty. Besides the Roman guard that was assigned to keep the tomb secure, the Bible tells us a large stone was rolled over the mouth of the tomb with Pontius Pilate's seal on it. This was probably a 2-ton stone, not one that could have been moved by someone inside the tomb, especially a man who had undergone such a brutal beating. On top of that, if anyone broke the seal on the tomb without official permission, the punishment was crucifixion upside down. Yet somehow, on that first Easter morning, the body of Jesus had vanished. Desperately seeking some way to explain what his followers were calling a miracle, Jewish leaders put forth their own version of events. The disciples, they claim, had stolen the body of their master.
Of course, you got the stone and the problem of working through that just logistically, but the big problem is the very persons who were transformed, whose life was turned upside down from despair to transformation. It was turned upside down because they believed they saw the risen Jesus. Now, if this were a fraud, first of all, how do they even account for that transformation? How do you account for that flip-flop? But the bigger problem is, why, when they leave their businesses and their families, do they willingly die for what they know to be false?
Where was the body of Jesus? The Jewish leaders could not account for it, so they fabricated a story to explain the unexplainable. But according to the Bible, the disciples of Jesus needed no such excuse.
On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord.
Without a doubt, the founders of the Christian church believed with all their hearts and souls that the greatest miracle of all time had occurred. Their leader and beloved Savior, Jesus, had risen from the dead. But skeptics demand more than just belief. They want scientific evidence. Is there proof that might satisfy these doubting Thomases of today? Is there a way to prove resurrection from the dead is physically possible? And might such evidence cause skeptics to consider the possibility that it actually happened some 2,000 years ago?
Some have wondered, why do we need to have evidence come to the aid of faith? But I would say, if we have scientific data, and we have historical data, archaeological data, these are helpful. It no more hurts faith to have a good foundation than it hurts marriage when you say, I do, and you make a faith commitment. That's based on good data. That's based on good facts. And that doesn't hurt our faith in each other and our faith commitment. And similarly, having evidence for Christianity has nothing to do with weakening our commitment to Jesus Christ.
Scientists say it is impossible to describe what happened before the universe existed. In the same way, many Christians assume there is no way to actually prove Jesus rose from the dead, at least not with physical scientific evidence. But is all that changing? Could it be that the scientific community's quest for knowledge about the origin of the universe might also lead them to the possibility of resurrection? In 2004, a particle physicist working independently in California made a discovery that could change everything we know about the world we live in. Examining the unique characteristics of a single fiber from an ancient cloth, the scientist discovered an apparent link to the secrets of the universe never before imagined. Could it be that time, space, and energy interact in a way never before predicted? The information derived from this amazing fiber may very well spark a controversy that will ignite a scientific revolution. But could it provide something much more important to mankind, like the secrets of life itself, perhaps even eternal life? And might this discovery lead us to evidence for the resurrection? Thousands of miles removed from the physicist in California, a group of digital scientists in Amsterdam focused their expertise on data from the same mysterious fiber. What they found stunned them all.
Holographic information is encoded in an interference pattern. And most probably there's more information in it, which I call like a blueprint of the universe, maybe an opening to a new science. You come in an unknown land. You don't have a GPS, you don't have a map. It's completely new. You have to reinvent science.
How could such radical conclusions be drawn from a single fiber? Could it be that the information gathered from an ancient piece of linen might make the difference between disbelief and faith for millions of skeptics worldwide? And how might the science behind this fiber help Christians confirm their own faith?
Christians have nothing to fear from science as long as it's objective. Certainly you don't have to check your brain at the door in order to be a believer. John chapter 14, verse 11, Jesus speaking, he says, "Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves." Jesus pointing to evidence. And then Acts chapter 1, verse 3, after the resurrection, it says that Jesus showed himself to be alive through many convincing proofs, evidence. No, Christians have nothing to fear from science.
The Bible tells us that after his resurrection, Jesus told the disciples, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." In spite of this statement, Jesus was still willing to provide physical proof of his resurrection to one very skeptical disciple.
The Gospel of John has in it a classic doubter, and his name is Thomas. And the way the story goes is that after Jesus' resurrection, Jesus appeared to the apostles, and Thomas wasn't there. So when Thomas returned, they told him that Jesus had appeared to them. Well, Thomas was not very happy with this. he actually couldn't believe what they said, and he in fact said,
"Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it."
So Thomas was very adamant, and it's very interesting because we have a man, an ancient character, who is very interested in data. Just like we have modern people today, they're very interested in seeing the facts. This man not only wanted to see the facts, he wanted to touch and put his hands in the wounds, almost like a forensic physician.
For the Apostle Thomas, proof of the resurrection was something he could physically put his hands on, something he could examine and verify. But some 2,000 years later, that kind of requirement presents a huge problem for Christians. Or does it? Could it be that the mysterious fiber that has the scientific community buzzing might provide us with physical evidence of the resurrection? Our search for answers begins in the late 1970s when scientists developed a unique device that allowed NASA technicians to read the terrain characteristics of distant planets derived from two-dimensional satellite photographs. But the developers of this amazing device were in for a shock when they were asked to analyze a photograph of something most of them had never heard of. From somewhere there emerged three-dimensional information. To these practical scientists, it was as if they were looking at something from another planet. None of them had ever seen anything like this before. A photograph of an ancient cloth brought the scientists face to face with the impossible. Three-dimensional information was being discovered where it couldn't possibly exist. Suddenly, a broad range of scientists took a professional interest in what had been, for those who were even aware of it, nothing more than a mild curiosity. But for one particle physicist, this tiny thread generated the most excitement. It is a single fiber from that same cloth, and resting on its surface is the hint of an image that is barely visible. Could it be that somewhere in the origins of this image lies physical evidence of the resurrection? The artifact is the Shroud of Turin, and without a doubt, it is the most picked at, probed, x-rayed, examined, revered, and reviled piece of cloth in the world today. For those who are unfamiliar with this particular piece of cloth, it has long been acclaimed as the object described in John chapter 20, verses 6 and 7. When Peter made his trip to the tomb on that first Easter morning, John's Gospel describes what he found inside.
He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth which had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen.
For over 100 years, researchers, historians, and scientists of every variety have attempted to determine if this linen cloth, tucked away in a cathedral in Turin, Italy today, could actually be the one referred to in John's Gospel, the burial shroud of Jesus. Is this really the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Or is it an incredibly convincing forgery? And if someone is already grounded in his faith, why should any of this matter?
In order to understand the shroud and know the truth about the shroud, we really have to put ourselves in the place of Thomas the doubter, the skeptic. And we have to really go and handle, basically, in a sense, handle the data, look at the data, and look at the evidence and see what it tells us about the shroud.
The shroud is an ordinary piece of hand-woven fabric that measures 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. These full-length dark lines are scorches from the fire that nearly destroyed it in 1532. The diamond-shaped patches cover holes resulting from that fire. During its long and storied history, many people have seen the shroud, but very few have actually been allowed to touch it. In the late 1970s, all that changed. A group of scientists were given unprecedented access to the shroud for 5 intensive days. Over the next several years, this tireless group, known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP for short, spent no less than 150,000 man-hours studying, testing, and interpreting the data. The results indicated the shroud was most likely a genuine first-century burial cloth from somewhere in Palestine. But then came a test designed to give a specific range for the age of the artifact. It's called carbon-14 testing, and the results were unexpected.
The radiocarbon dates that we obtained clearly put the shroud in the Middle Ages.
According to the carbon-14 tests, the shroud came into existence somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390. If the Apostle Thomas were alive today and searching for answers, those test results would undoubtedly raise a red flag, as they did for some scholars and Christians around the world when the outcome was announced. But if the carbon dating test is correct, does that mean that all the other scientific data about the shroud are wrong? Or is there another possible solution?
The problem of dating a cloth, not only the shroud, but I think any cloth, any old cloth, is not easy to solve completely and definitely.
According to the professor, the idea of a medieval origin of the shroud leads to an impossible thesis. The forger would have to find a man to crucify, flog him mercilessly, place him in a shroud, and then manufacture or simply wait for the image to somehow appear.
I think that is quite impossible, that what we cannot do today, it was very easy and during a medieval period.
Well, the carbon-14 dating remains a huge issue. One of the reasons is because the carbon-14 dating says that the shroud is 700 years old. If that's the case, it can't possibly be first century. Well, then how do you reconcile all the other evidence that says that it is ancient and that it is first century, or that it did originate in Israel? I mean, there are so many other streams of evidence that simply cannot be reconciled with a medieval date. And the question is, well, can they both be true? Well, they can both be true if for some reason what they dated is not representative of the entire shroud. What if something is wrong with the one sample that they took? Because, you know, they were supposed to take multiple samples, but they didn't. They only took one. And so now we have the most significant carbon dating test of the 20th century hanging on one sample.
In recent years, speculation about the age of the shroud has been raised to new levels, along with the hackles of some researchers. At issue is one simple question: are some parts of the shroud older than others? This possibility was suggested at the Syndene 2000 Worldwide Congress. Authors M. Sue Benford and Joseph Marino put forth the notion that a 16th century invisible patch had skewed the 1988 carbon-14 test on the sample from the Shroud of Turin. Their idea was backed by what seemed to be solid historical research, but the whole notion was immediately rejected as being technically impossible. At this point, another scientist, one of the original STURP team, became interested. Like others who had closely examined the shroud, he too was very skeptical of the whole idea of reweaving. So Raymond Rogers set himself the task of discovering whether or not scientific analysis could resolve the issue once and for all. In an interview given in 2005, he unveiled his results. Those who claimed reweaving was impossible were wrong.
So I got out the Ross samples, and I got out some of the shroud samples, and I went to work again. And lo and behold, in less than an hour, I knew that the Ross sample was totally different in chemical composition than the main part of the shroud. And then the shocker that really shook me up in looking at the Ross threads, I hit this one that was an end-to-end splice. And that's exactly the sort of thing that Benford and Marino were talking about in this invisible reweaving.
After coming to this conclusion, Ray called me one day and said flat out, "Tom, there is no scientific wiggle room."
While some scientists may continue to disagree, it would seem the results of the carbon-14 dating of the shroud appear to have been invalidated. Of course, even if the shroud can be proven to be a first-century burial cloth, that's not what we're looking for. As modern-day representatives of the Apostle Thomas, we seek proof it is the burial cloth of Christ. Does such evidence exist? Will it provide us with the most important evidence of all, evidence for the resurrection? Whether you're a skeptic of the resurrection or a true believer, there is no doubt that people from around the world find the image in the shroud to be utterly captivating. So much so that every time it has been displayed in public in the last 600 years, throngs of people wait in eager anticipation for hours, even days, just to catch a glimpse of the mysterious cloth and its image. But is it the burial shroud of Christ? Or is it a medieval relic, as the disputed carbon-14 test would have us believe? To find the answers, we must once again put ourselves in the role of a doubting Thomas. We must demand to see evidence that supports this claim. And some believe that this evidence can be found in a cathedral in Oviedo, Spain. The Oviedo sanctuary houses a relic almost as revered as the shroud itself. It is a small blood-stained cloth, one that may be described in the Gospels.
In chapter 20 of the fourth Gospel, we read how the two disciples, the beloved disciple and Peter, ran to the tomb on Easter morning, having heard that the tomb was empty. Now, there's been all kinds of speculation as to the position of the cloths, how they saw them. But really, that's unnecessary. The original Greek text is really quite clear on that.
And the other disciple ran more quickly than Peter, and came first to the tomb, and stooping, sees lying the sheets. Comes therefore also Simon Peter following him, and entered the tomb, and he beholds the sheets lying, and the kerchief which was on the head of him, not with the sheets lying, but apart, having been wrapped up in one place.
Rescued from the Persian invasion of Jerusalem in 614 A.D., this small piece of linen, known as the sudarium, was later brought to Oviedo, where for more than 1,200 years it has been quietly venerated as the head covering specifically mentioned in John's Gospel. Does the kerchief in Spain somehow match up with the shroud in Italy? Interestingly enough, the scientific studies that have been done on the sudarium do in fact support the findings of the shroud researchers. For example, modern investigative techniques permit the bloodstains on the sudarium to be superimposed over those on the shroud. The result is astonishing.
The stains coincide in the three main things. First of all, the blood group, AB. Second, stains corresponding to the back of the head are blood that was shed in life. There are many little stains. They were caused by some kind of sharp object that had penetrated the skin. By overlaying images of the two cloths, the blood stains, the actual shape of the stains, does coincide, which leads to another medical conclusion. These two cloths were used on the same corpse. It's a purely scientific conclusion. Now, if it covered the same corpse as the Shroud of Turin, well, obviously the shroud is at least as old as the sudarium.
According to Dr. Guskin, the parallel evidence found on both the sudarium and the Shroud of Turin lead to some startling conclusions. First, the sudarium and the shroud could only have covered the same crucifixion victim. That leads to the most obvious and more tantalizing question: who was the victim in the shroud? According to Dr. Guskin, there is only one possibility that can be supported scientifically and historically. That person was Jesus Christ. Having come this far in our investigation, even a skeptic like the Apostle Thomas might be getting excited about where the evidence has led us. Still, many questions remain. What secrets lie within the shroud's faint yellow image? Is it possible that new scientific technologies make it possible to uncover a message in the cloth never before revealed? what might that message mean to believers and unbelievers alike? And the most important question of all, does the Shroud of Turin contain evidence of the greatest miracle in history, the resurrection? To find out, our investigation must delve even deeper into the very fibers of the cloth itself and beyond. In 1898, a gifted Italian photographer named Segundo Pia was given unprecedented permission by the King of Italy to photograph the shroud. But when it was spread out for display, Segundo was disappointed in seeing the image on the cloth was extremely faint. Given the light in the cathedral, he was afraid there would be nothing on his photographic plates. Little did he know the images he captured would stun the world. The faint, almost ghost-like markings on the fabric actually appeared in reverse on his camera plate, making it a positive image. For the first time in history, the likeness could be seen in full, majestic detail, and the correlation between the image and the biblical description of the crucifixion was breathtaking and unmistakable. The image in the shroud is so striking, so vivid, that a modern forensic analysis is possible. Dr. Robert Buckland, a former coroner and forensic pathologist for Los Angeles County, is well acquainted with the signs of violent death.
This is the body of a 5-foot, 11-inch Caucasian male weighing about 170 pounds. On the head, there are blood flows from numerous puncture wounds on the front, back, and top of the head. There's a swelling over one cheek, consistent with a beating. The right wrist is covered by the left hand, but there's a puncture wound in the left wrist consistent with a crucifixion injury. The classical, artistic, and legendary portrayal of nails through the palms is incorrect because the structures in the hand are too fragile to hold up the weight of a man of this size without tearing free. There are streams of blood running down both forearms, originating in the wrist areas and controlled by gravity, so that blood flows toward the elbows with the arms elevated and outstretched. On the back, there are more than 100 lesions which appear to be scourge or whip marks. Historians have indicated that the Romans used a whip called a flagrum. This implement had 2 or 3 thongs, and at their ends were pieces of metal or bone which looked like small dumbbells. Here you can see how those end pieces from a Roman flagrum fit precisely into the scourge lesions on the body. Here on the front of the body is a large blood stain resulting from puncture of the chest by an instrument like a lance or a spear. This weapon penetrated the thoracic cavity through the pleural spaces and into the heart. Later, after the corpse was removed from the cross and turned, blood dribbled out of the chest wound and puddled along the small of the back. There's an abrasion of one knee consistent with a fall. Finally, a spike has been driven through both feet and blood leaked from those areas and has stained the cloth. The evidence of a scourged man who was crucified and who died of postural asphyxia and cardiopulmonary failure is clear-cut.
Now, in looking at the shroud and looking at the forensic evidence that we see, we know that a man was taken down from the position of crucifixion, placed on one end of a long cloth, and the other end was placed over his body. And we know this because there was moist blood clots that were still on the body, and that blood soaked into the cloth. And that information tells us that this man died in the position of crucifixion. Furthermore, we see evidence of a tremendous beating, a scourging. This man was flogged very, very badly. Now, from all this material, from all this forensic evidence that we see here in the shroud, we see that this man who is buried in this cloth died in the exact same manner that Jesus died. The question is this Jesus?
Is the image in the shroud the image of Jesus himself? To find the answer, we must ask yet another key question. How did the image come to be there in the first place?
The answer is really nobody knows. I mean, the image is inexplicable. We after thousands and thousands of hours of investigation using all kinds of highly technical gear, we still do not understand why or how this image came to be.
The shroud image is made from tiny fibers that are 1/10 the size of human hair. And the picture elements are actually randomly distributed like the dots in your newspaper photograph or magazine photograph. To do this, you would need an incredibly accurate atomic laser. This technology does not exist.
In spite of the fact that the latest and most powerful technologies have been brought to bear on the problem, science has been unable to explain the origin of the image in the shroud. Yet that has not prevented researchers from making some truly revolutionary discoveries. After years of studying the shroud, Dame Isabel Pitzik, a particle physicist, believes the shroud has brought science to the threshold of a whole new understanding of physics. While dealing with the position of the body within the cloth, she discovered one of those mysterious properties that cannot be, yet somehow is. An interface that divides the image transport into two hermetically separate yet simultaneous actions and forces, causing the shroud to be taut and parallel on both sides, creating a true event horizon.
In general relativity, we have found that there are certain things called black holes. Now, the surface of a black hole is called an event horizon. And it's called that because right at that surface, the laws of physics seem to change character drastically.
When you look at the image of the shroud, the two bodies next to each other, you feel that it's a flat image. But if you create, for instance, a three-dimensional object, as I did, the real body, then you realize that there is a strange dividing element, an interface, from which the image is projected up and the image is projected down. The muscles of the body are absolutely not crushed against the stone of the tomb. They are perfect. It means that the body is hovering between the two sides of the shroud. What does that mean? That there is absolutely no gravity. Other strange things you discover that the image is absolutely undistorted. Now, if you imagine that the cloth was wrinkled, tied, wrapped around the body, and all of a sudden you see a perfect image, which is impossible unless the shroud was made absolutely taut, rigidly taut. Everybody thinks that the tomb signifies death. Not at all, the exact opposite. The shroud and the tomb signifies an unbelievable beginning. We have nothing less in the tomb of Christ than the beginning of a new universe.
For centuries, the shroud has been viewed and analyzed as a record of a death, the end of the physical being. But Isabel Pitzik is suggesting that it is in fact just the opposite, a record not of an ending, but a beginning, which would suggest resurrection in its truest sense. And she's not the only scientist to find something scientifically astounding in the shroud. Dr. Petrus Soons believes there is much more to this piece of fabric than meets the eye. In 1931, Giuseppe Henri, a professional photographer, was commissioned to make a photographic record of the shroud in connection with a royal event, which meant many photographs would be taken. Using second-generation negatives from the 1931 Henri photographs, Dr. Soons and his colleagues have made some remarkable discoveries.
I contacted Dr. Alan Wenger and his wife Mary because I knew that he was in the possession of second and third generation copies of the negatives of the photographs that were made in 1931 by Dr. Henriet, a professional photographer. He made available these negatives to me, and I brought them to Holland, and in cooperation with the Dutch Holographic Laboratory, we digitalized them. And if a professional looks at negatives, he can see how much information is in it. So we estimated that it would be about 200 to 300 megabyte. But it proved to be that most of the negatives had information up to 1 gigabyte, which means 4 times the informations that we estimated. There could be still hidden in these digitalized files a lot of information that we still don't know about.
Dr. Soens took the negatives to a holographic science laboratory in Amsterdam to see if they would be willing to test a very unique and controversial theory he had developed about the shroud. Does it contain enough hidden information to produce a hologram?
First, it's important to understand what a hologram is. Basically, a hologram is a pattern of interacting microscopic rings or interference fringes, not unlike the pattern created when a handful of pebbles are tossed into a pond. Every area of the hologram sees and stores information about the whole image. If you break a hologram into multiple pieces, you have multiple holograms, each bearing information about the whole image.
And that is important for the Shroud of Turin also, because the upper arms are missing because of a fire in 1532. So if, what I believe, there's holographic information in the shroud, you would be able to activate that. You would see the whole body of the man in the shroud, including the missing upper arms. So when I came there with my photographs and told them there was 3D information in it, they were very skeptical about it. Because normally you don't make a hologram of a photograph. Then they started experimenting, and they found out that they could make a hologram of this material.
To correctly view these specially processed images of the hologram, please use your 3D glasses.
It is very important to notice also that we didn't change any data. So all the information that is in the digitalized files is also in the holograms. What we did in the laboratory is we checked the whole shroud for existing 3D information. The only 3D information that we have found was in the image of the body. We could confirm a couple of the findings, like for example the round little objects on top of the eyelids that have been interpreted as being coins. We cannot see inscriptions, but we can confirm that they are solid little objects. A point of controversy has always been the position of the legs, because you cannot see that very well on the photographs. On the hologram, of course, it shows extraordinarily well. The left leg was stretched, the foot was put in a diagonal position, fixed to the cross, and then the other foot, the right foot, was put straight in a vertical position on top of the other foot. That's why the leg is bended. And there was used one nail to nail both feet and fix them to the cross. The whole body holograms gave us the possibility to see the image of the man on the shroud under angles that had never been seen before.
But the most stunning piece of evidence was yet to come. In studying the amazing three-dimensional images of the hologram, Dr. Soens and his associates made a discovery that may well turn out to be monumental.
The most exciting things that we found in the hologram was under the beard, in the neck. It was known already that there was a white line, but nobody could ever say what that exactly meant and what it was. It's a solid object. It is in the form like something like an amulet that was put there. Now, after studying it for quite a while, I could figure out that there were letters on it, on top, sticking out a little bit. Now, these letters are ABA, Aleph, Bet, Aleph, which is the word Abba, which means father. Now, seeing the circumstances here and where the amulet is, that makes a lot of sense, because Christ used to call himself also the Son of God, the Son of the Father, the Son of the Holy One. So it is like saying, the amulet that was put probably by the apostles over there, like saying, here is the Son of God.
This information is going to have to be checked out, but if it were confirmed, this would just be along the line of several other things that have been written just recently. I mean, literally hot off the press books that are saying in early Christianity, two messages were preached from the very beginning. Jesus is divine, and he was raised from the dead. Those two are right there at the beginning. They didn't come decades later. And of course, that's the same proclamation that we find in the Gospels and in Paul.
Is this really the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Does the Shroud of Turin contain evidence of the greatest miracle in history, the resurrection? We will never know for sure what happened in that indescribable moment. Still, our quest for answers has provided an amazing amount of evidence to confirm that it did happen. Yet for Christians, there is something much more important than the evidence in the cloth. It is the message of the cloth itself.
If the cloth turns out to be the burial garment of Jesus, and we get the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus here, that's wonderful. But the emphasis should not be, in that case, on the cloth, but on the man who was crucified, the man who was buried, the man who was raised from the dead. That's the Christian message, and we have a lot of historical evidence for that in addition to whatever the shroud might be.
Well, something awesome really happened to this cloth. When we look at this complex image that we really don't understand, we realize that this event is something from outside of understanding of time and space. For who was this image made? Was it for the 2 billion Christians that live today? I don't think so. I believe that this image was created for all of humankind, and that it has a message. And through Jesus, eternal life is offered to each person who has, who does, and who will live on this earth.
Why has the shroud image endured for more than 2,000 years? Perhaps it is here to offer a message of hope to a world sorely in need of some good news. News that something real and all-powerful exists and has existed forever, beyond the reach of scientific explanation and theory, but not beyond knowing the truth. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Thomas experienced the unspeakable joy of meeting his risen Savior face to face. He touched the wounds and handled the flesh for himself. With that indisputable evidence before his very eyes, he couldn't help but believe. Could it be that the Shroud of Turin and all the other evidence of Christ's resurrection exist today for the very same reason?